I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It wasn't loud. There was no slamming door, no screaming match, no dramatic scene you'd see in a movie. It was quiet. That's what made it so devastating. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November. Gray sky pressing down against the kitchen window. The kind of day that already feels like it's asking too much of you. I was sitting at my daughter's kitchen table. The same table I had helped her pick out at a furniture store 3 years before. Holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I heard her say it. She didn't know I could hear her. She was in the next room talking on the phone, her voice low but not low enough. "I don't know what to do about her," she said. "She's always here. It's like she's become a burden." Burden. I sat there, perfectly still, both hands wrapped around that cold cup. And I thought, is that really what I am? Is that what all of it added up to? I want to tell you this story. Not because I want your pity. I really don't. I'm telling it because I think some of you out there might recognize something in it. Maybe you felt it too. That particular kind of hurt that only comes from someone you gave everything to. And I think if I share what happened to me, and what I eventually found on the other side of it, maybe it'll mean something to you. So let me start from the beginning. My name is Carol. I'm 63 years old. I live alone now in a small apartment in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It has 2 bedrooms. One I sleep in, and one I've turned into a little reading room with a second-hand armchair and more plants than any reasonable person needs. I have a cat named Henry. I take long walks in the morning. I drink my coffee hot now, always hot, and I take my time with it. But it wasn't always like this. For most of my adult life, I was defined by one role above all others. I was a mother, and not just any kind of mother. The kind who made it her entire life's work. The kind who wore that identity like it was her whole name. My daughter's name is Michelle. She came into the world on a cold February morning 29 years ago, and I can still feel the exact weight of her in my arms for the first time. She had a full head of dark hair and these tiny clenched fists, and she made this little sound. Not quite a cry, more like a question, and I looked at her and I thought, this is it. This is what I'm here for. Her father, my husband at the time, was a man named Dennis. We were married for 11 years. He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't present in the way that a child needs a father to be present. He traveled for work most of the time, and when he was home he was tired in that deep cellular way that made him feel like a guest in his own house. We were civil to each other, even affectionate sometimes, but we were never really partners. Not the way it counts. So it was mostly just me and Michelle. And I poured myself into her like water into dry ground. I remember her first day of kindergarten like it was a photograph I could hold in my hands. She wore a red dress with white buttons and these little white sneakers I had cleaned the night before with a toothbrush. She held my hand all the way to the classroom door, and then she stopped and she looked up at me and she said, "Mommy, will you miss me today?" And I laughed and said of course I would, more than anything. And she nodded like that settled something important, and she walked in. I cried all the way home. Happy tears mostly. The kind that surprise you. I worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local accounting firm so that I could be home when she got off the school bus every afternoon. I packed her lunches myself, every single day, with little notes tucked inside. Silly notes, nothing profound. Things like, "Knock knock, who's there? A mom who loves you." She used to save them in a shoebox under her bed. I found that out years later and it made my heart feel like it might burst. When she was 8, she went through a phase where she was afraid of the dark. Not just a little afraid, terrified in that deep animal way that 8-year-olds can be. She'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night, and I'd be in her room before she finished her first cry. I'd climb into that narrow little bed with the pink sheets and the stuffed rabbit named Professor Ears, and I'd hold her until she went back to sleep. Sometimes that took 5 minutes. Sometimes it took 2 hours. I never once made her feel like it was too much trouble. Dennis and I divorced when Michelle was 13. It was mutual and it was civil and it was honestly the right thing for both of us. He moved to Phoenix and remarried within 2 years. Michelle took it hard at first, as teenagers do, but she had her friends and her school and she had me, steady and constant, always there. High school was its own kind of beautiful chaos. The friendships and the heartbreaks and the college applications. Michelle was bright, genuinely deeply bright, and when she got into Ohio State I threw her a party that half the neighborhood came to. I stood in my backyard with a plastic cup of sparkling cider and I looked at my daughter laughing with her friends, and I thought I did that. I helped grow that person. I worked longer hours to help with tuition. I took on extra bookkeeping clients on weekends. I didn't mind. Felt like purpose. Felt like everything. She called me every Sunday during her freshman year. Sometimes on Tuesday nights too when things felt hard. I was her person. I was the voice she wanted to hear when the world felt too big. And there is no sweeter feeling in the world than being someone's safe place. She met Ryan during her junior year. I want to be fair when I talk about Ryan. I want to be honest without being cruel, because this story isn't really about him. He's a decent enough man. He works in finance. He's organized and driven and he loves Michelle in his own way, I believe that. But from the first time Michelle brought him home for Thanksgiving, I felt something shift. Something subtle. Like a picture on the wall moved just a few degrees off center. You can't quite explain why it bothers you. You just know something is different. He came from a family that operated very differently from ours. His parents were warm but reserved, the kind of people who showed love through practicality. Gift cards for birthdays, firm handshakes, a certain proud distance that they seemed to mistake for respect. They weren't close with their children in the way Michelle and I had always been close. And I noticed over the months and then the years that Ryan had opinions about what closeness was supposed to look like. Nothing overt at first, just small things. He'd make a comment about how often Michelle and I talked on the phone. A little joke, delivered with a smile, but underneath it a little edge. "There's your mother again," he'd say. And there was something in those 4 words that made Michelle put the phone down just a little faster than she might have otherwise. When they got engaged 3 years after they met, I was happy for her. Genuinely happy. I helped plan the wedding. I paid for the flowers, the whole floral arrangement for the ceremony and the reception both. Because I wanted to contribute, because I wanted her to have the wedding she'd always talked about. I stayed up late looking at centerpiece photos on my laptop. I drove her to 6 different bridal boutiques over 3 weekends. I hemmed and altered her veil by hand. On the morning of her wedding, standing in the dressing room with her while her bridesmaids fussed with her hair, she turned to me and held my face in her hands and said, "You did all of this, Mom. All of it." And she was crying and I was crying, and it was the kind of moment you fold up carefully and keep somewhere deep inside you for the rest of your life. Kept it. I still have it. They bought a house about 40 minutes from me, which felt like exactly the right distance. Close enough to be there when she needed me, far enough to give them their space. That was important to me. I knew the rules. I knew the unspoken code that a mother-in-law has to follow. I told myself I would give them room to build their life together. And for a while I thought it was working. I came over for Sunday dinners about twice a month. I babysat when they went out. When their first child was born, my granddaughter Sophie, the most perfect creature I have ever seen with my own 2 eyes, I took 2 weeks off work to help them settle in. I washed and folded tiny onesies. I rocked Sophie at 3 in the morning so Michelle could sleep. I made soups and casseroles and froze them in neat labeled containers. I did all of this because I loved them and because it felt like exactly what I was supposed to do. But something was changing. I couldn't name it at first. It was too slow, too quiet. Like the temperature in a room dropping 1 degree at a time until suddenly you're cold and you don't know when that happened. Michelle started texting less. I told myself she was busy, which was true. She had a baby, she had a job, she'd gone back to part-time, she had a house and a husband and a life that was full. I told myself not to crowd her. I told myself to be patient. But then the Sunday dinners became once a month. And then once a month became a vague, sometime soon. Phone calls that used to last an hour started to feel rushed, like she was waiting for a reason to hang up. When I visited, there was a new energy in the house. Not hostile exactly, but watchful. Like I was a guest who had maybe stayed 1 visit too long. I noticed that Ryan was often conveniently elsewhere when I came over. Not rude about it. Just gone. Running an errand or working late, or taking Sophie to the park alone. And when he was home, There was a kind of careful politeness to him that felt more like a wall than a welcome. I started to second-guess myself constantly. Did I call too much? Did I offer too much help? Did I say something wrong, do something wrong? Was I somehow overstepping in ways I couldn't see? I replayed conversations in my head at night, lying alone in my bed, staring at the ceiling, searching for the mistake I must have made. I started being more careful. I waited for Michelle to call me instead of calling her. I turned down invitations to visit because I didn't want to seem eager. I stopped offering help unless it was asked for. I shrank myself quietly, the way women of my generation were taught to do when they sensed they were taking up too much space. And still the distance grew. There was a particular Sunday in September, about a year before that November afternoon, when I drove over to see Sophie's second birthday party. I had spent weeks finding the perfect gift, a handmade wooden toy kitchen that I'd ordered from a small shop in Vermont, painted in soft yellows and greens because those were Sophie's favorite colors. I had wrapped it myself with brown paper and a real ribbon, the kind you curl with scissors. When I arrived, the driveway was already full of cars. Ryan's parents were there, and his sister and her husband and their kids, and several couples I didn't recognize, neighbors I'd never met. The party was already going, balloons and streamers and a table of food I hadn't known about. Nobody had told me it was going to be a big gathering. Michelle had just mentioned the week before, "Sophie's birthday is Sunday, you should come by." I stood in that backyard and I smiled and I made small talk and I watched my daughter move through the crowd, easy and laughing, and she would glance my way occasionally with a quick smile that felt, and I hate this word but it's the right one, performative. Like she was showing the room that she was a good daughter. Like I was a box to check. Ryan's mother stood next to him near the grill, and I watched him lean in and say something to her, and she laughed, and they had the easy, comfortable body language of two people who talk often. He had never stood that close to me. I ate a piece of birthday cake and drove home and sat in my parking lot for a long time before I went inside. I want to pause here and be honest about something. Because I know what some people might be thinking. They might be thinking that I was too involved. That I relied on Michelle too much for my own sense of worth. That after my divorce, I never built a full life of my own, and I leaned too hard on my daughter to fill that space. And I believe, there's some truth in that. I didn't have many close friends. I had acquaintances from work, women I got coffee with occasionally, but no one I could truly call my person. After the divorce, I never dated again. Not for lack of opportunity, but because it felt disloyal somehow, or maybe because I was just afraid. My life had gotten very small, and Michelle was at the center of it, and I had let that happen. I'm not telling you this to excuse what she did. But I want to tell you the whole truth, because the whole truth is the only kind worth telling. By the following November, I had been feeling the distance for over a year. I had talked to no one about it. I didn't want to seem like a complaining mother. I didn't want to be that woman. So I kept it inside, and I kept showing up when invited, and I kept making myself smaller, and I kept waiting for things to somehow find their way back to what they used to be. And then came that Tuesday. I had offered to come over and watch Sophie while Michelle had a dentist appointment. It was a simple, practical thing. Michelle had said yes, and so I came, and the appointment ran long, and Michelle came home to find Sophie and me on the living room floor with a puzzle, both of us perfectly happy. And then Michelle got a phone call, and she stepped into the bedroom to take it, and I stayed in the living room with Sophie. And the bedroom door wasn't fully closed. "I don't know what to do about her," she said. "She's always here. It's like, she's become a burden." A pause. I know. But it's hard to tell her to back off, she'll fall apart. She has nothing else. Another pause, longer. Ryan's been saying the same thing. That I need to set some limits. I just don't know how to do it without her completely losing it. I heard her laugh, a short, tired laugh, and then her voice dropped lower and I couldn't make out the rest. Sophie was looking at me. She was 2 years old and she understood almost nothing of what was happening. But children can read a room in ways we forget. She put her small hand on my knee, this gentle unconscious gesture, and she said, "Gamma." "I'm okay, sweetheart," I said. And I kept my face very still, because my granddaughter was watching me, and she didn't need to see anything other than her grandmother being fine. But I was not fine. I stayed until Michelle came out of the bedroom, and then I said I needed to get going, and Michelle looked slightly guilty in a way that told me she knew I might have heard something, and she walked me to the door and said, "Thanks, Mom, this was really helpful," and I said, "Anytime." And I walked to my car and I drove 2 blocks away, and then I pulled over and I sat with both hands on the steering wheel and I let myself feel it. All of it. Every piece of it. The birthday party and the short phone calls and the watchful silences and the years of making myself smaller and all of it coming down to one word. Burden. I sat there for a long time. It was getting dark. The street lights were coming on one by one. A woman walked past with a dog on a leash and the dog looked at my car and the woman didn't. And the ordinary world just kept going like nothing had happened. I thought about calling Michelle. I thought about knocking on her door and saying, "I heard you. I need you to tell me what you actually meant." I thought about getting angry, really angry, the kind of anger that finally says all the things that have been dammed up for too long. But I didn't do any of that. Not yet. I drove home. I fed Henry. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the parking lot lights, and I thought about who I was outside of being Michelle's mother. And I couldn't answer that question. That was the most frightening thing. Not the word she'd used, but the fact that I couldn't answer the question. I didn't sleep well that night. Or the next. I went through the following week in a fog, going to work and coming home and sitting in the quiet of my apartment, and trying to understand how 62 years of living had brought me to a place where my own daughter thought of me as a burden, and I had no idea who I was without her. I called my sister Linda on Saturday morning. Linda is 4 years older than me, lives in Pittsburgh, and she has always been the kind of person who says the thing you need to hear even when you really don't want to hear it. I told her what had happened. All of it. Including the birthday party, and the dwindling phone calls, and the years of shrinking myself. There was a silence when I finished. Then Linda said, "Carol, how long have you been doing this?" "Doing what?" "Making yourself so small that you disappear." I didn't answer. I just sat with that. "You need to talk to her," Linda said. "Not to yell at her. Not to make her feel guilty. But honestly, you both deserve that." The conversation with Michelle happened on a Friday evening 2 weeks later. I asked if I could come over, just the two of us. Ryan took Sophie to his parents for the evening, which Michelle arranged. And I remember thinking that this small act of his, clearing space for a hard conversation, told me more about the situation than I had previously understood. He knew this was coming. He was probably glad it was coming. I sat across from Michelle at that same kitchen table. She had made tea, which felt like an act of love and an act of nervousness all at once. I said, "I heard what you said on the phone. 3 weeks ago when you were in the bedroom." She closed her eyes. "I heard the word you used," I said. "And I want to talk about it, but I want to do it without either one of us being cruel. Can we try to do that?" She nodded. She looked the way she had as a little girl when she'd broken something and knew she had to tell me. Ashamed and scared, and also somehow relieved that the waiting was over. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. I don't want an apology yet," I said. "I want you to tell me the truth. Tell me what's been happening for you." She was quiet for a long moment, and then it came out of her slowly, carefully, like she was feeling her way through something dark. She said that after Sophie was born, she had needed space to figure out who she was as a mother, as a wife, as a person. And she said that I had been there so much, so immediately, so completely, that it had started to feel suffocating without her ever knowing how to say that. She said that Ryan had felt it too, that I was always in the background of their marriage, always a presence even when I wasn't physically there, and that he'd been frustrated for a long time. She said she had started to feel caught between two worlds, mine and her own, and that she hadn't known how to build a door between them instead of a wall. She said she loved me. She said that very clearly. She said, "I have never once stopped loving you, Mom. Not for a single day." But she also said, "I think I need you to love me differently." I thought about what that meant sitting there in her kitchen. Love me differently. She wasn't asking me to love her less. She was asking me to love her in a way that left room for her to breathe, to be an adult, to have a marriage that wasn't always triangulated by my need to be needed. And the hardest thing I have ever admitted in my life, the thing that I sat with in that kitchen and felt all the way down to the floor of myself, was this. I had needed her to need me. Not because I was selfish, but because I had never built anything else. My marriage had ended. My career was modest and functional but not fulfilling in any deep way. My friendships were thin. My interests outside of my family were nearly non-existent. And without any of those things to fill me up, I had quietly, without meaning to, placed the entire weight of my sense of purpose on my daughter. That is not love. Or rather, it is love, but it is love that has curdled into something else. It is love with a need inside it that the other person is not able to meet. I understood that in Michelle's kitchen. I understood it and it broke me open. Cried. Michelle cried. We sat across that table and we were two women who loved each other and had hurt each other in the ways that only people who love each other deeply are capable of. I told her I was sorry too. Not for loving her, never for that. But for building a life so narrow that she became its whole foundation. That wasn't fair. That was never fair to her. We talked for 3 hours. It wasn't fixed that night. These things don't fix in a single conversation. But something was opened. Something that had been sealed and quietly rotting was finally let into the air. And air, even when it's cold, is always better than none. I drove home at 11 o'clock and I walked into my apartment and I stood in the middle of my living room and I looked around at the life I had built. It was clean and it was quiet and it was mine. And for the first time in a very long time I asked myself a real question. What do I want? Not what does Michelle need? Not what would make me useful to someone. What do I, Carol, 62 years old, divorcee, bookkeeper, mother, what do I actually want? I didn't have an answer that night. But the fact that I was asking, that was something new. The first thing I did was call my doctor and ask for a referral to a therapist. I had never been to therapy in my life. I had always had a vague private feeling that therapy was for people with real problems, serious problems, not just a woman who loved her daughter too much. But I called and I went, and the therapist, a quiet woman named Dr. Scheffler who wore reading glasses on the end of her nose and had a rubber plant in the corner of her office. She helped me understand some things about myself that I had been carefully not looking at for decades. She helped me understand that I had used my role as mother to protect myself from the grief of my marriage ending. That I had wrapped myself in my daughter like armor. That it felt noble and selfless, but it was also, underneath, a way of avoiding the terrifying question of who I was outside of being needed. It was hard to hear. I went every other week. Sometimes I drove home and sat in the parking garage of my apartment building and cried before I could go inside. But I kept going. The second thing I did was join a book club. I know that sounds small. It is small. But it mattered. It was a Thursday night group at my local library. 8 women ranging in age from 40 to 75. And we met the first Thursday of every month in a room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights and terrible decaf coffee. The first book we read while I was a member was a novel about an older woman traveling alone through Portugal. And I read it in 3 days and arrived to that first meeting with more to say than I had said to any non-family member in years. There was a woman in the group named Vera, recently retired, sharp and funny and completely uninterested in pretending anything was different from what it was. She sat next to me that first night and she said, "First time? I can always tell the first-timers. They sit like they're not sure they're allowed to take up a chair." And I laughed, really laughed, and she handed me her number in the parking lot afterward and said to text her if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I texted her the next day. I started walking in the mornings too. Not for exercise, though that helped. But because I had discovered that if I walked before the day had a chance to fill itself with other people's needs and my own old habits, I could think. I could just think quietly about what I wanted. About who I was becoming. The apartment, which had always felt like a place I simply existed, started to become something I actually inhabited. I bought a small second-hand armchair and put it in the second bedroom. I got Henry, who is a grey tabby and who has the personality of a disgruntled professor, and who I love unreasonably. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, not because I thought I would be good at it, but because I had always wanted to try it and had never done anything about that wanting. I was not good at it. My trees looked like broccoli and my skies always came out streaky. I didn't care. And here is the thing about starting to build yourself a real life at 62. The world doesn't make it easy. Our culture has a story about what older women are supposed to do. And it doesn't usually include the idea that you get to be a full person with desires and friendships and creative pursuits that are just yours. It tends to assume you've already had your chapter, and now you're meant to wait quietly in the wings. I have stopped waiting quietly. Over the months that followed, Michelle and I rebuilt something. Not the old thing that was gone, and honestly it needed to be gone. But something new. Something with different proportions. I started calling her on Sundays, once a week. And we kept those calls to a reasonable length. And I didn't make her feel responsible for my emotional well-being when we talked. I visited when I was invited. And I kept my visits warm but finite. I stopped reading her silences for signs of what she needed from me and started paying attention to what I actually had to offer. And I'll tell you something surprising. The less desperate my love became, the more genuine it felt. The less I needed her to need me, the more she seemed to actually want me around. It wasn't immediate. It was slow and it was real and there were setbacks. But it happened. The first time she called me just to talk. Not for any practical reason, not because she needed something, just because she'd seen something funny and thought of me. I sat on the edge of my bed afterward and I thought, that's it. That's the thing I actually wanted. Not her needing me. Or choosing me. There's a difference. And it took me 62 years to understand it. I want to tell you something about Ryan too. Because something unexpected happened there. About 8 months after my conversation with Michelle, Ryan and I had dinner together. Just the two of us, Michelle's idea. She thought we needed to clear the air. We went to a pasta place near their house. And it was awkward for the first 20 minutes. And then he said something that surprised me completely. He said, I never thought of you as a bad person. I just didn't know how to tell Michelle what I needed without it sounding like I was asking her to choose. I said, I didn't know how to not need her the way I did. He nodded. We ate our pasta. It's not a warm relationship, Ryan and me. We don't call each other. We don't share inside jokes. But when I come over now, he doesn't disappear to another room. He sits at the table and he tells me about things at work, small ordinary details, and I ask questions and he answers them, and that is enough. That is actually enough. Sophie turned 3 last February. The birthday party was smaller this year. Just family, which I was considered part of without anyone having to say so. I sat in Michelle's living room and I watched Sophie open presents with the fierce concentration that 3-year-olds bring to everything, and Ryan's mother was there on the couch across from me. And we talked about completely normal things. Gardens and a podcast she'd been listening to, and whether cold winters were better for the allergies than warm ones. I was not trying to prove anything to anyone. I was just there. Felt like breathing. I think about what I would tell a younger version of myself if I could. The woman who was packing little notes into a kindergartner's lunchbox, pouring herself out with such love and such gladness. I would tell her, keep doing that. Keep loving that way. There's nothing wrong with love that is that whole and that wholehearted. But I would also tell her, you are more than what you give. Your worth is not a measure of how much you are needed. The loneliness you are pushing down will not stay down forever. Your own life is not a waiting room for other people's lives. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to want things. You are allowed to be, separately and completely, a person. I would tell her, build something for yourself while you build everything for her. Not instead, alongside. Give her roots and give her wings, but make sure you have some of each too. Because children grow up. That is the whole point, that is the success of the thing. Your child becoming her own full person is not a loss. It is not rejection. It is the goal you were working toward from the very first day. And when she gets there, you need to have somewhere to stand. Not in her house. Not in her marriage. Not in her daily life as a permanent fixture. In yourself. I didn't understand that until it was almost too late. Until I was sitting at a kitchen table holding a cold cup of coffee and hearing myself described in the most painful way a mother can be described. But I got there. Slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of help and a lot of hard mornings, I got there. And I want you to know, if you are a mother feeling invisible, or a daughter who doesn't know how to have this conversation, or someone somewhere in the middle of a relationship that has gotten tangled up with need and love and old unspoken things, I want you to know it can be untangled. Takes honesty. takes gentleness. It takes a willingness to feel the thing you've been avoiding. But it can be untangled. Last spring, Vera and I took a 4-day trip to Savannah, Georgia. We stayed at a bed and breakfast with a porch that looked out over a courtyard full of Spanish moss and old magnolia trees. And we drank sweet tea and walked through the old streets and talked about our lives and our regrets and our plans with the freedom of two women who have earned the right to say exactly what they think. On the last morning, sitting on that porch with my coffee, hot, always hot now, I looked out at the magnolia tree and I felt something that I want to describe as carefully as I can because I want to get it right. Felt like being enough. Not because I had achieved anything particular. Not because I had been validated by the right people or finally arrived at some destination. Just enough. Present in my own life. Glad to be inside it. I texted Michelle a photo of the courtyard. She texted back a string of heart emojis and then, 30 seconds later, she called. "That looks gorgeous," she said. "It really is," I said. "Are you having fun?" "I really am." She laughed. That warm laugh I've known her whole life. "Good, Mom. I'm so glad." And I believed her. We are different now, Michelle and I, than we were in those early years. We don't have the closeness of a mother and a young daughter who are everything to each other. But we have something that I think is more sustainable, and maybe in some ways more honest. We have a relationship between two grown women who love each other and have chosen to keep showing up. She chose me. Not because she needed me to need her. Not because she felt guilty. But because she wanted me there. And that, after everything, is the thing I would go back for if I could go back. Not the years of being indispensable. Not the feeling of being someone's whole world. But the small, ordinary Tuesday afternoon phone call from my daughter. Just because she thought of me. That is what love looks like when it's free. I hope you find it. I hope if you're holding on to someone too tightly, you can learn to love them with open hands. And I hope if you've been making yourself smaller and smaller in someone else's life, I hope you go home tonight and take up a little more space. You're worth it. Promise you that. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've been that mother or that daughter or someone somewhere in between, I'd really love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me your story, even just a little piece of it. Because one of the things I've learned this past year is that none of us are as alone in our experiences as we think we are. And sometimes the most healing thing is just to hear someone else say, "Me too." If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need it today. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe and hit the bell. I'll be back with more stories just like this one. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves out there. Truly.